This section is on pedigree identification. So on your sheet, you should see this pedigree 3 times. And the reason for that is because we're going to do the genotypes of this pedigree 3 different ways. For the first pedigree, we're going to assume that the shaded symbols are dominant and write all the genotypes accordingly. For the second pedigree, we're going to assume the shaded symbols are recessive and determine the genotypes accordingly. And then for the third one, we'll assume the shaded symbols are sex-linked recessive and determine the genotypes that way. So for the first one, if the shaded ones are dominant, that means all the unshaded ones are recessive. And so the unshaded ones we know right away are going to be homozygous recessive, little d, little d. So this is where you should see a problem because two recessive parents cannot have a dominant child. So there's no way that this one can work. So what that told us is that this trait cannot be inherited dominantly. So now we'll try as recessive. So now the shaded ones are recessive and everyone else is dominant. So we again do the recessive ones first. So now those two are little d, and everyone else is dominant. And if we do the genotypes, we can get this one to work out because it is possible for two dominant parents to have a recessive child. So since we were able to get the genotypes to work out, we know that there is a possibility that this trait is recessive. So the third one, we're now saying that this is a sex-linked trait, and these are sex-linked recessive. So again, we do the recessive individuals first, and since those are female, they have to be XX, and on each X chromosome, they're going to have a recessive. So their genotypes would be X little d, X little d. So then once the recessives are done, the next ones we do are all of the dominant males because dominant males, there's only one possible genotype for them. So all the dominant males have to be X big DY. This is where we see the problem because we've got this daughter right here who's inherited a recessive from each parent, but she can't inherit a recessive from her dad. So this one also does not work. So by doing the pedigree 3 different times, we have determined that this has to be a recessively inherited trait. Now, to save time, there are some hints so that you don't have to do every single pedigree 3 ways to determine what the inheritance is. And so these are the hints to determine if a pedigree shows a dominant, recessive, or sex-linked trait. If a trait is recessive, it's possible for children to have a trait their parents don't. And oftentimes we will see a recessive trait skip a generation and then reappear again later. For dominant, if children have it, at least one parent has had to have it. It can't skip generations. And so dominant traits we will often see in every generation. And then finally, sex linked. Sex linked will appear recessive. So there can be kids that have the trait that their parents don't. We can see it skip generations. But one thing that sex linked traits will often show is that more males will be affected than females. So if we use that information and we look at these 4 pedigrees, we should be able to determine their inheritance. So the first one, the one in the upper left-hand corner, the shaded ones are showing a dominant trait. And the reason we know that is because we have a child that doesn't have the trait from 2 parents that do. And so the only way that we can have a trait like that is if the parents are dominant and they've passed on a recessive. There's no way we could have recessive parents that all of a sudden have a dominant kid. So the shaded ones in that first one are dominant. If we go to the upper right-hand corner and we look at that, the shaded ones are also dominant. And that's because, again, we have offspring that don't have a trait that their parents do. So it's possible for dominant parents to have recessive children. Again, it's not possible for recessive parents to have a dominant child. So the shaded ones in that second one are also dominant. The third one, the lower left-hand corner, we have a recessive inheritance. The shaded ones are recessive because we can have all of a sudden a recessive show up even though the parents didn't have it. And then the last one in the lower right-hand corner, that's going to be sex-linked recessive because it appears recessive. We have it completely skipping that second generation. So we would guess recessive, but if we look more closely, we would see that it's only males that are affected. So by using these hints, it gives you a good idea of where to start. Now, if you choose a type of inheritance, but then you're doing the genotypes and they don't seem to work out, you may have initially guessed it incorrectly and you might want to try it a different way. But hopefully, this will give you some clues so you don't have to do the genotypes 3 different ways for every single pedigree that you end up working on.